what is it that a business analyst would do, and uh, what is it that we would cover as part of the course. So that's a broader 2-point agenda what we would have for this course, right? Post that, if you have any questions, I would be glad to take up or answer any of these questions. Yeah. Uh, right. So the slide what you see is crisply summarizes what a business analyst does, right? Now, if I'm asked about what is the most important thing a business analyst would do, that would be a business analyst would understand the requirements from the business team and document it. So these two would be the most important task what a business analyst does, right? A significant part of the work as a business analyst would be spent talking to the customers, engaging them in various methods to understand the requirements, right? So effectively understand the requirements, and then document it in such a way that the technical team can understand it, right? So there are some ways in which you can engage the customer to understand the requirements better. So one way, intuitively what we know is a one-on-one discussion. So you'll ask question, and then the SME or the business user, the subject matter expert, would tell you the detailed requirement and you would understand it. But that's only one way, right? So there are some 10 ways in which you can understand the requirements. So there could be some workshops, or you could conduct a brainstorming session. You could have a observation technique. You could engage in a prototyping technique. You could go for a reverse engineering technique. So all these are the ways in which you can understand the requirements. Okay. How do we do it, and in what context would each one of those would be relevant? You need to understand that as well, right? So we would cover that as part of the course as such. I'll give you more details about it in the next slide, but that's something what as a business analyst you need to know. You need to know the various ways in which you understand the requirements. Simultaneously, when you are understanding the requirements, you also need to document it. Now, how do we document it? It's not just a simple plain English prose what you write, right? So it's not a one pager or two pager requirement based on your understanding. There are some frameworks which are you know available, which ensure that you have completely and comprehensively captured all the requirements, right? So if you have filled up that, the that if you've used that frameworks like a use case, it ensures that you have understood uh, all the requirements clearly, and they are not ambiguous, and the technical team can understand it in a lot more easier way, right? So there are multiple ways in which you can document your requirements. The most popular ones being the use cases. And these days you can see that we execute the projects in agile mode. So user stories are used. You can use ER diagrams. You can use some process flows. You could use mind maps. You could use wireframes. There are multiple ways in which you can document your requirements. Okay. So as a business analyst, you know all these techniques, and also understand in what context and for what kind of requirements, which is a technique I should document it, right? So once you capture all these requirements, these requirements get into a document called as a BRD, right? So business requirements document. So this is one of the most important deliverable coming out of a business analyst, right? So you pretty much own this document called as a BRD, right? And all your functional requirements as well as non-functional requirements, which are basically something like your performance, security, and availability. All those gets into your business requirements document, right? So at the start of the project, once you talk to the customer and understand the requirements, then you go back and document it. So all those requirements get into a business requirements document. So that's one of the key deliverable coming out of a business analyst. Now the BRD would be used by the technical team to create I would say uh, your technical design documents, and then actually write the programs, right, and test it out. right? So that's the process of a typical project, right? So close to 70% of your time is spent on these activities wherein you'll understand the requirements and document it, right? Apart from this, you'd also contribute to various other tasks. So what are they? The first one is enterprise analysis, wherein you identify projects, right? So what kind of project should I take up for this organization, right? And what is the, whether it's feasible or not, what is the investments I have to make, what kind of returns would I get, right? So some analysis needs to be done, and then you present it to your senior folks in the organization. The senior management would look at the business case what you've prepared, and then either approve or reject the project depending on the um, you know the case it's presenting, right? So all those activities related to identifying a new project and then building a business case for it would constitute your enterprise analysis, right? Then once the project budgets are approved, you get into your planning mode, right? So your project manager and you as a business analyst and the technical architect would sit down and then create a detailed project plan, right? So you would identify what is the detailed schedule and what are the dependencies. So you basically would learn how to create a project plan, right? But though you're focusing only on the requirement related activities, you'd learn all those activities to create a work breakdown structure, to identify the stakeholders, then the dependencies on each of those tasks, right? And how to represent that using a project plan. You would learn that. Along with this, you'll also learn how to manage scope, uh, how to manage change, and how to manage risk, right? So you will establish those frameworks during your planning phase. So that's the reason we are covering it. But there are ongoing activities, so they happen throughout the project. Your scope is managed right from the start of the project, from your planning till your completion of the project. Similarly, changes to the project are also right from the start till the end of it, right? Uh, so while we while these are continuous activities, we establish the base framework during the planning phase. So we need to understand how to you know uh, manage scope, changes, and risk for a typical project, right? So we'll learn that as part of the planning phase, right? Then once a plan is ready, you would get on to your requirement analysis and documentation. You would create a business requirements document, right? Once the BRD is prepared, the technical team would work on it. They would create a technical design documents. Then the actual programs would be written, and the system needs to be tested, right? So while you are not owning the testing part, you need to understand this process, because you would coordinate with the customer for various activities, right? So basically, we would cover what a typical test life cycle would be, right? So what is it that you do as part of the planning of the testing? How do you create the test cases? How do you execute them? How do you analyze your defects, right? And how do you track and report the progress of a acceptance testing, right? So what type of testings are there? So there are multiple things about testing which you need to understand, which will cover as part of the solution assessment and validation, right? Along with this, a small session on communication, which helps you understand the communication needs of the team, create a communication plan, finalize onto the artifacts required for communication. So all this is something which you need to understand as a business analyst, right? So this would be the 6 knowledge areas which a business analyst has to you know uh, possess to get into the role of a business analyst, right? Now, who has classified or who has specified these 6 knowledge areas? Uh, there is an organization called IIBA, which basically oversees this profession of business analysts, right? So it's a non-profit organization. So they are the ones who offer the CBAP certification, Certified Business Analyst Professional, right? So this is what um, you know uh, IIBA does, and they have published this book called Business Analyst Book of Knowledge. So we are aligned to that Business Analyst Book of Knowledge. So the 6 knowledge areas are actually specified by them. So the course outline is also structured along these 6 knowledge areas, right? And in addition to that, I have added one more section, one more knowledge area, which basically gives you an overview about what the industry, how the IT industry works, right? Who are the various other stakeholders in it? What is the typical governance structure, or the team structure in a client location, in a vendor scenario, right? As well as when a project is formed, how is the team structure? You'll understand all those details. We'll also understand the various phases of a project, right? So what are the steps involved in a typical project, right? So there is a planning phase, then you have requirements phase, you have design, development, testing, and then your implementation phase, right? So each of the phases, you'll get a lot more details about who are the people involved, what are the tasks they do, what are the deliverables coming out of that. You get a lot more clarity onto about how things work in a typical project, right? We'll also look at the variants of uh, the software development life cycle, right? So it could be a waterfall model, it could be a prototyping model, it could be a V-shaped model, right? Or it could be an agile model. So we'll learn the various types in which projects are executed and what is your role of a business analyst in that typical scenario, right? So the initial few sessions, the 2-3 sessions, what we cover as the industry overview, gives you a broader picture of how industry works, who are the other people you will generally interact with, and you get a lot more clarity onto the role of a business analyst, right? Though you'll not be able to do it, perform each of those activities, but at least you'll know what is it that I need to do as a business analyst by the time we complete the first part. Then we get into the details about each of these, detailed knowledge areas, and then understand, the role of what a business analyst is expected to do. Right. So as part of planning, we learn the various stakeholders and understand the stakeholders of the project, and we'll identify the activities what you would do and how to estimate for them. Right. So basically, provide the inputs for the project planning. We learn to manage scope, change, and risk, right? Then there are some 10 ways in which you can understand the requirements, right? So we learn those 10 techniques, and also understand in what context would each one of them would be relevant, right? So this helps us in understanding or eliciting the requirements in a better way, engaging the customer to understand the requirements in a better way. Now, all of these topics are covered by case studies, right? So right after we complete the theoretical part, we would pick up a case study and then make sure that we apply the learnings from what we have learned onto a practical scenario. So most of the case studies are actually, uh, you know, some of my previous projects what I've executed. Some of them are simpler projects, simpler examples, so that it drives the concept easier, right? So because if you look at requirement analysis and design, so there is a prerequisite for this, that you have to understand the requirement. To document your requirement, you first have to understand it. Now if I take a complex requirement, something like maybe a derivatives accounting, or maybe a compliance product, or maybe a analytics product, right? So understanding the requirement itself would take us a lot of time, right? So that rather than waste our time on uh, you know uh, no, on non-critical things, you take some simpler examples, like how do you withdraw cash from an ATM, right? Or how do you borrow book from a library, or how do you create appointments in a hospital, right? So the requirement is simpler in that case. So it drives the concept of understanding the framework in which we are documenting the requirement, right? So we'll be in a better position to think through the logic and then apply it to a situation where we understand the requirement, rather than taking some complex requirement, right? So that's the reason for our analysis and documentation techniques. I will take simpler examples, right? So something like your cash withdrawal, or your library management system, or something like that. So wherein you clearly understand the requirement, it's not too complex to understand, right? Now, requirements are documented in multiple ways. So earlier they used to be structured analysis, right? So we don't really use them anymore, except for data modeling, right? So ER diagrams are still used to understand your underlying data structure, right? So we would cover that, and most of the times our projects are documented using are actually executed in object orientation, because that's the most popular way of programming and analysis and design as well. So there are UML diagrams, and use cases is one of the UML diagrams. It's basically a modeling language to model your object oriented analysis. Uh, so you'd use that use cases to understand the requirement. I'll give you a context about what UML is, what object orientation is, and what use case diagram is. We'll capture that in detail. And then there are basically 9 UML diagrams. I'll give you an overview about what each one of them does as well. Right? We will capture the requirements sometimes in user stories if it's an agile requirement, if it's an agile project. Right? So how does agile work? Right? So what is the methodology? How is it different from the typical SDLC? What is your role? How do you capture the requirements? So all those details we would cover. Right? So by the time you complete this topic, you should be able to work in a agile project as well as a traditional SDLC project to capture requirements either using user stories or use cases. Apart from these, two main techniques of object orientation and agile, right? So there are multiple other techniques which are more secondary in nature, right? So they are more kind of supporting ways of representing your requirements. It helps you to make your requirement a lot more clearer, right? So those are the other techniques which we'll focus on, like process modeling or mind maps or wireframes. There are multiple other techniques, right? So we'll send us a session or two on learning these techniques as well, right? So by the time you complete this part, you'll be in a position to understand the requirements using the elicitation models and then document your requirements as well. So pretty much you should be able to uh, write a BRD. You'll understand what gets into a BRD, what are all the various technical sections, and what all details do I need to capture into a BRD, right? Uh, then a small session on communication helps you understand how to create a communication plan, how to identify the artifacts required for communication, how to ensure that information needs of the various stakeholders are met, right? So that's a overarching objective of the communication knowledge area, right? Then as part of testing, we would focus on these two levels of testing, SIT and UAT. So you'll learn what are the steps of testing, right? What is your role in that? Who are the other people involved in it, right? So all the details you would learn about it. So by the end of this session on testing, you'll be able to create a test plan. You'll be able to write the test cases. You'll be able to execute them and also analyze the defects, right? And track the progress of a testing as well, right? How do you interact with testing, and what are what is from a process point of view? You'll understand what happens during the testing once you complete this knowledge area, right? Enterprise analysis, like I said, is usually the first step, but I'm covering it at the end because it's a complex topic, and you'll be in a much better position to understand it when we understand the rest of the topics, right? So I'll introduce you to enterprise analysis at the end of it. We are not going to cover this in detail because for a in fact, this is a more specialized field, and usually people with significant amount of experience get into these activities, right? In fact, it's actually getting involved into a separate role called as an enterprise architect, right? So there are some certifications also, like TOGAF is one organization which gives certifications on that, the Open Group Architecture Forum, right? So yeah, so not so important for us from a, a business analyst who has just started career, or maybe below 5 years of experience. You definitely would not get into these activities, I would say. So let's focus on that, and we'll focus more onto the details or the basics of what a business analyst would do, right? And apart from that, we'll cover a lot of other topics, like maybe a session on a small session on SQL and Visio and Rally, right? So something which is facilitating the process of requirement analysis, the overall requirements. We would look at that as well. So any specific requests coming in, I would be glad to take that up as well, right? I keep updating it, so it's pretty much comprehensive, and we have a you know well thought through and comprehensive course which is being offered here. right? The kind of audience I look at is mostly people who don't really have any background for IT projects, come from a non-technical background, and who don't even understand how projects are executed, right? So there are absolutely no prerequisites for the course. I assume that you have absolutely no knowledge, and we would start over from there. And by the time you complete the course, you'll be in a position where you would be able to start working as a business analyst, right? Uh, so mostly, it's for people who are who just are out of the college or who are planning in from joining from other industries. Can look at even techies who wants to move into a client-facing role or a business analyst role, right? So this is a good uh, way to move on, right? The training material is and everything is well organized. You'll be given access to a training portal, right, where everything all regarding the training material as well as the recordings from the session, would be uploaded onto that. So maybe your training coordinator would guide you through the portal and then help you out later, right? So all that operational issues would focus later on once you enroll for the course, right? Uh, I think one more slide I will talk about is the career paths. Right now, usually people would not stick on to a business analyst role for long. Maybe you work for like 8 years, 10 years, and then move on from there. Why? Because your career gets stagnated after a point, right? So you don't want to get same kind of billing rates. You want to move on. You want to you know you aspire for better salaries. So some of the career progression could be into consulting, wherein you gain significant amount of experience in a particular knowledge in a particular domain. So something like a banking or maybe a retail, right? So you understand the technology, you understand the business, so you get into consulting kind of roles. So rather than taking the requirements from the customer, you'll be in a position to tell the customer that this is what you need to do, right? So that's basically consulting. You get into project management roles because you already are doing a lot of coordination here, so you extend that and then get into a project management role. Business development is another option, right? Where if you have a flair for selling, right? So you would talk to your prospective customers, understand their requirements, right, and then submit a proposal. So rather than taking a requirements from a, and customer, right? So you're trying to understand the requirements from a prospective customer, and then submitting a proposal saying that this is how we will execute projects for you, and then win business from them, right? Or if you feel that you're comfortable in this role, you can actually grow in this role as well. So you could manage a team of business analysts under yourself, and then manage it as a practice as such, right? So that's a four broader career paths you move on in from a business analyst role. Yeah. And the kind of knowledge and skill levels what you need to have good interpersonal skills. You should be able to communicate clearly, right? So whatever the other person is saying, you should be able to understand, and what you're saying, the other person should understand it without any ambiguity, right? So that's what I mean by communication skills, right? You should be able to have you should be able to analyze any particular requirement, break it down, and then up try to fit it into the framework, and then uh, ensure that you have well thought through the code, the requirement, right? The knowledge of IT SDLC, you will gain it through this course. Domain and functional knowledge, you will gain it over a period of time, as and when you uh, work on some projects. So that exposes you to some ways of how the business works. That's how you generally you know gain that. But these two are not, at least the domain of functional knowledge is not a mandatory thing, right? So it's a good to have skill. Why? Because it makes your requirement elicitation process easier, right? So you can understand the requirements in a much better way. Okay. So yeah, I think that's what I had to cover in this course. I'll open up the forum for you know, asking any questions. So if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or type in your question. I'll unmute you and then you can ask your question. Any questions? Anything related to the role of a business analyst or the course, feel free to ask, right? So it's use this opportunity to clarify all your questions. The course would be like 5-day course, 1 hour every day, right? So that's the timelines we generally work on. We can, I think we'll communicate about the timings of the course. Usually it would be the same time. But yeah, uh, yeah. Any questions from any one of you guys? Feel free to ask it. Uh, or just raise your hand. I think you click on that hand raise hand button. I'll okay. Namrata has a question. Right. What is the full form of UML? It's Unified Modeling Language. Now, UML is basically a modeling tool, modeling language, I would say, not a tool. So, you must have looked at prototypes, right? So, let me take an analogy to help you understand this better. Right now, let's say you're in the construction industry. You're not going to start the construction right away, right? So first you would create a prototype. You want to see how your final you know final building would look like. So what do? You would create a small replica of how the actual building would look like, right? And once you have that view, then you would actually start constructing it, because this is a point of reference for you. This is what you want to achieve, but it's not full fledged. It doesn't have all the functionality, and it's more like a miniature version of it, which will help you visualize how the final product looks like, right? So UML does the same thing for object orientation, right? So it helps us understand how our final product does looks like. So it's a series of diagrams which helps you represent what is it that we do as part of prototyping, right? What is it that we would you know want our software to do, right? How do we capture our requirements? How do we design it? All those things are covered as part of your UML, right? So UML stands for Unified Modeling Language, right? And yeah, it's used to model your object orientation projects. Okay. Uh, yes, the PowerPoints will be given to you, and not just PowerPoints. You'll be given a lot more training material other than the PowerPoints, right? So let me give you a glimpse of it. You'd be basically given an access to a folder, a portal, basically, where all this training material is available, right? So we upload this training material. I'll just give you a glimpse of it, what I have it in my hard disk, right? So you'll have all these presentations which you'll get. You will get a lot of additional training material for each of the topics what we are covering it. So maybe during the uh, course, when I'm talking about the topic, I'll refer you back to the training material on what you can refer to read additionally about that particular topic, right? And for each and everything what you're preparing, there is a template available, right? So every contribution from a business analyst, there would be a template uh, available in this templates folder, right, which you can refer to. So this gives you an actual perspective of how and what is it that is expected from you uh, to fill in. Okay, hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Anything else you guys want to ask? Okay, so if you don't have any other questions, maybe we can conclude the session. I'll give a minute more. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and then we'll uh, log on from here. All right. So anyway, thanks for attending this session. I hope the session was useful, at least to understand what the role of a business analyst is and what is it that we cover in the course. I hope that gave you a little more clarity onto the role and get a glimpse of what a business analyst would do, right? So please get in touch with your training coordinator who was coordinating for this training to take it up further, right? Hoping to see you all, and good night. Bye bye.